Welcome back. This is the second lecture of the first week with the title Basic Structures of Christendom. And as I think I indicated in the previous lecture, this lecture is essentially squeezing one or even two courses that I teach in the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages into one lecture. So it is going to be abbreviated. But there are basic concepts and understandings that we have to have in terms of medieval Christendom, which I'll be talking about shortly and defining for you, to understand what is really different and what changes in the course of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Because we can't understand if something is new if it's not really new. That's a faulty understanding. So there's no way I can really grasp or capture the entire Middle Ages, at least until approximately 1300, which is where kind of our story sort of begins. Next lecture, the crisis of the later Middle Ages, in a single lecture. But this is a period, this course is a period when Christendom is crumbling and falls and changes, and that is a major event in the history of the West, so to speak, and what brought that about, how did it come about, etc. But before we can understand what changed and what crumbled, we have to understand what Christendom was. It's also problematic because, in general, there is a lot of misunderstanding about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages has been referred to as an age of faith, where people didn't really think for themselves. They just followed what the Pope said. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. The Middle Ages were a dynamic period, also very long, depending on when they start. We could say approximately 500 CE to somewhere in the later Middle Ages, so for at least 1,000 years. Society is constantly changing, and people have always been people. People have always had their own thoughts and beliefs and ideas. There was a lot of conflict between emperors and kings and the Pope. No one just simply followed what the Pope said. And there was dynamic developments. Now, I can't go into all of these here and now. But rather than an age of faith, even though there is an extent to which that is not inaccurate, we could also refer to the Middle Ages as an age of reason, at least from the 12th century on. And in fact, that is how one scholar, Edward Grant, who was one of the outstanding scholars of medieval science, referred to the Middle Ages as an age of faith, or an age of reason, which is rarely seen to be associated with the Middle Ages, but it was there. So, to really understand what was going on when we get into the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, we need to understand what was coming before. And there we begin with the concept itself of Christendom. What is Christendom? And what was Christendom? I have up here on the slide a definition: a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Now, it has been argued, and this is not just by me, but in general by scholars, that when in the Middle Ages we find the term in Latin Christianitas, we need to translate that as Christendom rather than Christianity. Christianity is a system of faith and belief and religion, whereas Christendom was this concept of this overarching understanding of who we are. And it really emerges with Charlemagne at Charlemagne's court when he's crowned Roman Emperor, not Holy Roman Emperor, but Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800. And we start seeing in the sources references to the Christian Empire, the Christian people. Now, Rome, going all the way back to the Roman Empire, was or became Christian. First Constantine, Emperor Constantine in 313, after fighting his way into ascendancy to become the Emperor of Rome, issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity. Christianity had been an illegal religion within the Roman Empire, but Constantine made it legal. It's often been said that Constantine was the first Christian emperor. That is questionable, because Constantine, throughout his life, even though he started to support Christianity and the Christians, very strongly so, he still used the motto Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. And he was seen as also defending paganism, or what became known as paganism, which was simply a reference to the countryside. Paganos was someone who lived in the country. And since Christianity spread primarily, not exclusively by any means, but primarily in the cities, those people in the country were seen as kind of, by the Christians, ended up seen as being backwards and adhering to traditional Roman folk religion, and therefore they were called pagans, and so pagan concepts became distinct from Christian. It wasn't until the end of the 4th century, with Emperor Theodosius, when he proclaims Christianity the only religious religion of Rome, the only legal religion of Rome. So within a period of a single lifetime, Christianity went from being a persecuted, illegal religion to being the only legal religion in Rome. And this had all kinds of consequences that we can see. But yet there's a distinction to be made between Rome becomes Christian and Christian Rome, or Christian Empire. So that is kind of a technical difference, or a slight difference in nuance, but it's an important one. And the point is, in the sources, Rome never fell. There was the emperor in the east, and there's nowhere in any sources that talk about the fall of Rome. That was a concept developed by the English Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, who published the first of his 5 volumes on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. And since Gibbon, that concept of the decline and fall of Rome has stuck. The problem is that is an historiographical interpretation rather than an historical description. And if we look at the sources, in the 6th century, 7th century, people are still referring to the empire, the emperor who is in Constantinople, because the Eastern and Western leadership split. And that's a long story, which I'm not going to go into here. But after Theodosius, between his 2 sons, that goes all the way back to the Roman Constitution of having 2 consuls. It's a long story. If you're interested, if I can take my early medieval, Middle Ages course. So it's a different development that arises. And that's too when I said that Charlemagne was crowned Roman emperor, not Holy Roman Emperor. That doesn't come about until Otto I in 962, in terms of the exact title. But the concept was that this is just the continuation of Rome, of the Roman Empire. Now, Charlemagne was part of it. And conceptually, that was the idea. Now, I've referred to Christendom as the myth of Christendom, because a myth, as I use the term, as you should know by now, if you read that first document, the second document for this week's reading, is not simply equated with falsehood. Myth is expressing a reality, a truth, that can't be expressed in literal terms. And so when I talk about the myth of Christendom, there's no such thing as Christendom, but it was a concept, an idea. Just like in so many ways, there's no thing that is America, but America is a concept and an idea. And we can obviously say, too, an ideology, even if there's contested what that ideology actually is and what it stands for. But the same with Christendom. There was not a single unified, accepted understanding of what it is that we are and how we actually function and work, even though there was this overarching view of we are the Christian empire and Christian Europe. Now, that being said, we have to look at how it kind of developed, and we see that this concept of Christendom became the overarching, let's say, operating program. I'm not a computer person. I'm not into technology, but there are many different programs within the operating system there are many different programs within the operating system of Windows. And so in some ways we could refer to Christendom as the Windows of the Middle Ages in terms of the operating system, but that doesn't mean it's all one and the same thing, if that makes any sense. But it is the overriding concept, and it's precisely that concept, that myth, that we will see breaking down and being replaced in the course of the 14th, 15th, 16th century by another myth that I refer to as the myth of the nation state. That's kind of jumping ahead of ourselves. So we have everything from the myth of Rome, which was conceived as this eternal, divinely sanctioned empire, to becoming the myth of Christendom, also seen as an eternal, divinely sanctioned empire, to the myth of the nation state. But that will become later. So, within the context of this ideology or myth of Christendom, what were some of the basic structures that we need to understand if we're going to understand the changes that come about later on? And I've identified a few here. I can't go into all of them, but a few. And the first I'm going to deal with is manorialism. Now, I deal with this first because probably most people have heard the term feudalism or feudal Europe. That term is problematic. There has even been scholars who have argued that we shouldn't use the term. I'll get back to what that term means in a technical sense shortly. But manorialism is distinct from feudalism, even though it's part of the overall system. Now, we can't talk about feudal law, as I will be doing shortly too, which includes the law governing manners. But manorialism, as I have there on the slide, was the basic social and economic system of Christendom. It was economic, and the wealth of Europe was based, the economy of Europe was based on agricultural production, in many ways on until the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century and 19th century. So we see here that manorialism is based on the manor, M-A-N-O-R, not M-A-N-N-E-R, which was a plot of cleared land for farming. There was a lord of the manor, often a knight, and I'll be talking about knights in a minute too, and then peasants who worked the land. Now, peasants, and I'll be talking about this shortly as well, was a legal definition. So there was a wide variety of legally designated peasants. Shortly in the next couple of slides, I'll be talking about the three orders. There were the nobility, the clergy, and then the peasantry. So if you weren't part of the clergy, if you weren't a member of the nobility, you were by definition a peasant, and that is a real problem. And that those three orders, that was a structure that remained until the French Revolution. If you've ever had a class on the French Revolution, one of the things I think you will have heard or learned is that the three estates, the first estate, second estate, and third estate, and one of the issues with the oath of the tennis court was to overthrow that system of the estates and voting by estates, but to vote in Parliament or in the estates general based on population rather than based on status. And those estates is a direct relation to the three orders, ordo in Latin in Middle Ages. So that's where kind of that is coming from. But it was a system of mutual rights and responsibilities. I have up there, I said, the rights of peasants was to farm, to hunt, and to fish, to collect firewood. The rights of the lords was to receive taxes from the production, and to have the peasants work on their land when they needed to. Responsibilities of the peasants was to work on the Lord's domain, or the Lord's own land that the Lord kept for himself, and to pay taxes in kind what they were farming for themselves. And the responsibilities of the Lord was to protect the manor and its inhabitants, to provide for the spiritual and physical well-being of the manor, which is a basic understanding of the nobility and structures at the time whereby the prince or the lord of the manor, and the lord of the manor could be a knight, it could be even a non-noble lord of the manor who was put there by the knight or a higher level lord. The idea was that if I'm a leader, a ruler, a political ruler of any sort, I am responsible for my subjects. I'm responsible for their physical well-being and their spiritual well-being. Now, that last point up there on manorialism is the proprietary church. And proprietary means own, just ownership. And so the concept was early on that the church was something that was based on the manor and was something that was the possession and property of the Lord. And the Lord had to provide for the church, for the people. Now this time there's no system of training of priests. Priests usually came from the local population. The level of learning was very low. They had to be able to say the Mass in Latin, but not much more. I'll maybe say more about that as we go along later on. Not today, but in later lectures. And so it's this concept of these are not only my peasants, but these are my people, and I'm responsible for them. I will have to answer to God for their spiritual well-being too. That puts a different perspective on things. Number one, and number two, ended up leading to serious conflict between the laity, or those who were not ordained, and the clergy, or those who were ordained. And I'll be talking about that shortly as well. So this manor and manorialism was the system that provided the economic basis of wealth in the Middle Ages, and socially was organized around the village, the town, and was a means of how most people kind of lived in or around a manor, farming the land that they could farm for themselves while working for the Lord. They were happy to do so. We'll see and talk about peasant revolts beginning in the later Middle Ages on into the 16th century. But there's not a single peasant revolt in this course, where the peasants said, we are revolting and don't want to be peasants. They're always saying, we are happy to be peasants. We just want our traditional rights, those rights I have up there of hunting and fishing and collecting firewood. Those are the same issues that were there all along, all until the 19th century, when Karl Marx comes along and argues that the peasantry should have the right to collect firewood. Because what happens in the later Middle Ages is that economically the lower nobility are being squeezed, financially, economically. And so what do? They pass along that being squeezed to the peasants. So all of a sudden, rights of peasants started to be either taxed or revoked. So you may have heard or know of or seen or whatever Robin Hood, and even if it's the Disney version of Robin Hood, the idea that these are the king's deer. In earlier times, it was like, no, they're just deer. And yes, the king will go out and hunt and get the deer, but the peasants could too, to provide for their food. And firewood, if you do happen to get a deer and you skin it and clean it, and then you want to cook it. But if you don't have firewood, you can't cook it. So that too, and you can't make bread without fire. So that's the whole issue of firewood. So when all of a sudden lords started saying, no, you have to either not do this, you can't collect firewood, or you have to pay for it, or you can't hunt and fish. These are the lord's deer, the lord's birds or fowl, and the lord's fish. That put a huge squeeze on the peasantry. And so their revolt in the later Middle Ages was simply saying, give us our traditional rights. It all goes back to this earlier concept of manorialism, and this mutual obligation of rights and responsibilities for both the Lord and the peasants. And keep in mind, the peasants were everybody who were not noble or part of the clergy. So, the proprietary church was the early system where lords of the manor And consequently, the higher up we go, princes and kings and emperor viewed the churches as their own property for which they were responsible to provide for the spiritual well-being of their subjects. That is an important point to keep in mind. But that is essential manorialism. But then we move to feudalism. And feudalism is very much related to manorialism, but distinct. The term feudalism comes from the Latin feudum, which technically is a grant of land necessary to support one knight. Now, what is a knight? A knight is a mounted warrior. You have to be a noble to be a knight. You have to have a horse, you have to have armor, you have to have armor for your horse. It takes a fair amount of means to be able to support oneself as a knight. And you can't just do it alone. You need to have servants or squires to help you. So a knight is more of a battle unit than a single individual. I often kind of make the analogy to a tank. I'm also not a military historian, but and don't know much about the military actually, but I know that a tank, you don't have just one person in a tank. There's a whole group that works in the tank and keeping it going, maintaining it, and all those other things. But it's still one tank. That's the same thing with a knight. A knight is one fighting unit, and it takes a lot of people. So there has to be a certain amount of financial support for that. So the feudum, technically, or a fief in English, Old English, fief, a grant of land, was what was required to support one knight. Now, it became then more general, so that any grant of land would be considered a fief. So if I'm king, I might grant you, my vassal, a term I'll get back to, a bunch of land that technically is made up of a lot of fiefs in terms of the territory needed to support one knight. There's no fixed amount of land, because if you are in Tuscany, let's say, very lush, productive agricultural area, a fief is going to be much smaller than if you're in northern Germany. But the whole point was what is necessary to support one knight. But yet, the term fief also referred to all grants of land. Now, the problem is that it's very much a top-down structure, even though it all developed from the bottom up. I'm not going to go into all of that. That's, we can take, again, early medieval or high medieval classes. But because coming from the king, who would give large areas of land to vassals, the vassals then too would be lords of that land. So they'd be a vassal to the king, but lord of their own, own territory. And they would then also parcel out their major fiefs to other people. It's called sub-infeudation, where you have multiple grants of land all coming theoretically from the king to the lower level lords, to then even lower level lords and nobility, all the way down to the individual manor. Now, feudalism was an issue of mutual responsibility. It can be tensions here, because if I am vassal to a lord, I have responsibilities to that lord. But as the holder of a fief, I am lord over my fief, whether that is just technically enough land to support one knight, a manor, or if it is the more general term that it is, a whole region or state, like the dukes, counts, etc., would be lords over their territory, even though they're technically vassals of the king or of the emperor. And in medieval Christendom, everyone was seen as being a vassal to the emperor as such, in theory. And everyone accepted that theory. The problem was, if I'm king of France, I don't really care about what the emperor says because I'm king. And we'll see this conflict also breaking out in the later Middle Ages between the feudal structure of, yeah, I'm your vassal, emperor, but I'm king of my own. I don't have to listen to you. And that causes all kinds of conflict. So this feudal system, even with is codified in feudal law in the 12th century, where we get the three orders, the legal definitions of these three orders, was not without its problems and had an inherent structural problem. Because if you weren't a noble or a member of the clergy, you were designated as a peasant legally. And yet, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you were poor working on the land, especially around the year 1000. There's a huge beginning of a huge increase in population, and there begins to be what's called, we talk about the rise of the cities, where the establishment of individual cities really grows exponentially beginning in approximately the year 1000. So, and with that then comes the arts, merchants, banking develops, all these different aspects that are requisite for living in a city. And that you could have very wealthy merchants who technically and legally were peasants because they weren't noble and they weren't members of the clergy. So the term peasantry is a very wide spectrum of socioeconomic affluence, so to speak, and not a single thing. So even from the beginning, there were inherent structural problems with the system of feudalism, which there I have seen up there as the political and cultural system of medieval Christendom. So we have manorialism as the economic and social structure. We have feudalism as the political and cultural structure, whereby they're all based on mutual responsibility, swearing oaths. I'll be talking more about that later on, I think. And so there's a problem that was not really recognized at the time until the problems break out. And it's like, oh my gosh, what do we do about it? And the rise of cities, the increase in population, the rise of the artisan class, the banking class, was certainly forced the issue. So what are some of the inherent problems? I already then mentioned the three orders: those who fought, the nobility; those who prayed, the clergy; and those who worked, the peasants. And the problem there is it was kind of clear who were part of the nobility, because that's by blood. It was rather clear who's part of the clergy, even though the clergy could be everything from your simple parish priest to the Pope. But those who worked could be actual day laborers, serfs, to wealthy merchants and artisans. Then we have the rise of cities, towns, and communes, which I already referred to. A commune was not where people sat around smoking pot and holding hands and being naked or anything. It was a technical term for a free, independent city. There began with the rise of cities this desire to say, you know what? We would like to function as a whole. We would like to fulfill our feudal dues, not all individually, but as a corporate entity. So we are going to petition the king or the emperor to be directly under their authority, outside of the feudal hierarchy. Now, for the lords and the emperor, and the kings, that seemed to be a good idea. So they would grant charters to cities, recognizing them as free, independent cities. Those free, independent cities in France were called communes. In the empire, which I'll be talking a bit more about, they were called the imperial cities, the Reichsstädte, the imperial cities. And this could cause problems, because once you have a political entity outside of the feudal hierarchy, there's going to be tensions between those free, independent cities and their immediate feudal overlord. But yet their immediate feudal overlord could not do much about it because he was a vassal to the higher-ups who had granted the charter. Number one. Number two, this is really the beginning of a new concept that developed in the Middle Ages that was to have huge significance and is still with us today. Basically, a corporation. Because that is what the free cities, whether the free imperial cities or the communes in France, that's what they were, a corporate structure. What is still the basic definition of a corporation? A legal person, whereby a corporation can sue and can be sued. in law, independently from the legal responsibilities of its members. So, this whole beginning of corporate thought, and I'm not saying that this is the origins of the multinational corporations we have today, but in some ways it begins here because the whole understanding of what a legal person, a legal entity is, starts developing in terms of the cities and communes. Likewise, with the rise of merchants and things, guilds started to be formed. And guilds, too, had this corporate structure whereby you needed to be a member of a given guild. That's how you got your training to become a baker or a builder or a weaver or whatever, the arts and the skills. And that, too, was this corporate mentality. And that then directly led to the emergence of the universities in the early 13th century, because they started out as guilds, basically. The term universitas in Latin means the whole. And we still have that connotations with it when we talk about the universe. The universe is everything, the whole. That's what a university was. It was the whole, and at first they're the guild of students and the guild of masters that then produced legally. They had rights and responsibilities, but rights, they were granted rights, and it became shortened simply to the university. So at Paris, the early documents of Paris from the late 12th on into the early 13th century refer to the universities of students and masters at Paris. So later it becomes fused into simply the University of Paris. Same thing at Oxford. So that's a later development than where I am now. But this corporate structure is important because also it relates to what is the church. Is the church a corporate body? Or is it simply individual members of the proprietary church? And theologically, what constitutes the body of Christ? If the church is the body of Christ, or the body of all the believers, faithful, how does that work? What are the structures of the corporate structure of the church, so to speak? And that would be a debate that had been going on almost all along and would continue to go on into the 16th century. Another problem with that, in terms of inherent structures too, is not only the cities and towns, but there were two basic hierarchies that governed Christendom: the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. Now, ecclesiastical hierarchy was the clergy. To be a clergy person meant that you were ordained, which is one of the sacraments, which I'll talk about shortly. I think I already mentioned it could be everything from a simple parish priest on the local manor, part of the clergy, to the Pope. The laity are simply those people who are not ordained. So the emperor, the kings, the dukes, the counts, all the princes, all the lords of the manor are part of the laity. All the peasants are part of the laity, unless they're members of the clergy. Now, in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the lay hierarchy, the emperor, and conflicts and overlaps. Here, the next slide here is ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies, what kind of gives the breakdown. For both, God is at the top. Not everyone agreed with that. And the top of the ecclesiastical hierarchy is the Pope, with the College of Cardinals, then archbishops, bishops, priests, and then the people. The lay hierarchy, we have God, then we have the emperor, then theoretically we have kings, then dukes, counts, and margraves, and then knights, and then the people. Now the problem is when there is conflict between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy, because the question is, who really ruled Christendom? And if you asked the laity, of course, the laity rules Christendom. The emperor is the ultimate ruler of Christendom. But if you ask the clergy, it's the Pope, of course. The College of Cardinals was the advisor to the Pope. The emperor and kings had their own advisors in the Reichstag, or the legislature, the imperial legislature, or the Estates General in France, or the Parliament in England, all serving at the pleasure of the king or the emperor, but they're too to support the emperor, just as the College of Cardinals was there to advise and support the Pope. But the question of who ruled Christendom was problematic. Because if I am a prince and if I am going to war with another prince, should the Pope or any bishop or archbishop have anything to say about that or not? How does that play itself out? Well, one basic division was that the ecclesiastical hierarchy was in charge of the spiritual side of things, the soul, and the lay hierarchy was the temporal hierarchy concerning the body and life in this world, and they shouldn't interfere with each other. The problem was the issue of sin, in causa peccati, as it was called, in the case of sin. So if one king invades another Christian king, the Pope can say that is a sinful act, you cannot do that. Then the king who invades has to think, do I listen to the Pope or not? That was clearly the case with the whole issue of King John in England in the 12th century, early 12th century, because he was at war with France. And he goes to war with France, and the French king appeals to the Pope, and the Pope says, John, you cannot do that as a Christian prince. What do we do? So John had an idea, so he excommunicates him. I'll get more to the power of excommunication shortly. So John had to say, okay, what do I do? Do I follow what the Pope is saying or not? That's a problem. Finally, John had to admit that he needed to, politically. So he appeals to the Pope, makes amends, and so I'll tell you what, Pope, I will give you England as a fief. I will just give it to you outright, even. And I will hold it of you as a fief. So I'm granting you the kingdom of England, which you will then grant it back to me as a fief, and you will be my overlord. And the Pope says, that sounds like a good deal. Okay, I'll take it. And therefore, then, John, or the Pope, told John that he had sanctioned, and also told Philip of France, Philip II of France, to back off and not attack John. So the political and the spiritual are always in conflict during this time. We see that with conflicts between emperors and popes. Henry VII, Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV in the late 11th century had one of the most famous conflicts. And it just continued throughout the Middle Ages. It was never really solved. How did these two hierarchies interact and work together? At times they did. For example, in the Crusades in the late 11th, early 12th century. Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade in 1095 because in one way he said, okay, we're fighting amongst ourselves. Why don't we combine forces and fight against our true enemy, the infidel out there? Especially with Islam having developed in the 7th century and spread. There was this perceived threat, even if somewhat distant at various times. So why don't we go work together to retake the Holy Land, help out the emperor in the East, who is still there in the East, and fight against the infidel. And that's what they did in the First Crusade very well. From the Western perspective, the First Crusade was a huge success. Subsequent crusades were less and less and less successful. And that is actually also when the issue of indulgences first arise, because it's in the context of the Crusades. Subsequent crusades, all of a sudden, the political leaders of Christendom were not as keen to go on crusade. So they said, Pope, is there any way I can get out of this obligation? Because the Pope made it an obligation for every Christian prince to go on crusade. The Pope said, well, okay, I will grant you an indulgence from your obligation to go if you provide the money for someone to go in your place. Now, we'll be talking a lot more about indulgences later on. But this is the origins here, and this theological, political, spiritual, temporal struggle over who ruled Christendom, the ecclesiastical hierarchy or the lay hierarchy. If you ask the Pope obviously says, I rule Christendom. If you ask the emperor says, I rule Christendom. Pope works for me, or the Pope says the emperor should be working for me. There was never, ever a conflict between church and state in the Middle Ages or on into early modern Europe. that is so often repeated. But if you asked the people at the time, the scholars at the time, is there a conflict between church and state? They say, what are you talking about? They're the same thing. The church and the state are the same thing within Christendom. The issue was, is Christendom a state church or is it a church state? If you ask the ecclesiastical side, it is a church state. If you ask the lay side, it is a state church. There was constant conflict between the ecclesiastical powers and the lay powers. That's what the conflict was over. And those two different hierarchies have then been abstracted to be referred to as the church and the state. Do not talk about the conflict of the church and the state. You talk about the conflict between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. That is central, but conceptually, at the time, this concept of church and state and the separation thereof, that is such a modern concept that they wouldn't have understood it in the Middle Ages. If you said, is there a separation between church and state? They would say, what are you talking about? They're one and the same. Even Marcellus of Padua, whom I'll be talking about later on when we get to the 14th century, who argued that the papacy should be abolished. 1324. Papacy should be abolished. Marcellus argued. That's not because he was against Christianity in any way, shape, or form, nor was he against the church in any way, shape, or form. He was against the ecclesiastical hierarchy. He was not against the priesthood. He said a priesthood is absolutely necessary for a state to be run well, because Christianity is the only true religion. But we'll get there when we get there on that. But that's some of the issues I wanted to bring up here in terms of the inherent problems. Because it was a question over who ruled Christendom, who had the final say. And with that clause in causa peccati, the ecclesiastical hierarchy had kind of a trump card to play, because they could almost say, anything that you're doing, Prince, and I don't agree with, is a sin, ergo. But then did the princes always just sit and listen? No, not at all. Not at all. And we'll see more about that as we go along further on, especially when we have things like Philip IV of France in the late 13th, early 14th century, sending a posse to go and kidnap the Pope, bring him back to Paris to be tried for heresy. That's kind of the type of conflict that was going on. Yeah, that kind of being said, we need to realize that both the Pope and the Emperor were elected officials. So much that we hear in the Middle Ages about, the inheritance and blah, 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 blah. Both the two top offices of the two hierarchies were both elected. The cardinals elected the Pope, and the major German princes elected the Emperor. Now, the whole issue of the Emperor goes back to Charlemagne. But after Charlemagne, his son is Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious had 3 sons who couldn't agree, so they split up the empire between those 3 sons, between Charles the Bald, who got the western part of the empire, which became France. Louis the German got the eastern part of the empire, and Lothar got that central part. And this was all done in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. That central part went to Louis the Pious's son, Lothar. Lothar got the title of emperor, whereas Charles the Bald was king of Western Frankish king of the Western Frankish kingdom, and Louis the German was king of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and Lothar was the emperor, had the central part between the two, the region of Lothar, Lotharingia, or in French, Lorraine. And France and Germany have been arguing over the Lorraine ever since, all the way up through World War II. That goes all the way back to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. So this idea, if you're king of the Franks, or king of France, in the Western Frankish kingdom, you are technically underneath the emperor, Lothar. Charles the Bald was, but he could care less. It was his brother, and they were fighting each other for control for all along. This was a compromised agreement back in 843. But the theory was that Lothar would have the title emperor, even though he didn't have the power. Anyway, whereas that is the background of this. So even on until the 16th century, the King of France still, we'll see a lot of conflict in the 16th century between the King of France and the emperor. Technically, it was underneath the emperor, but he didn't really have to pay much attention to that, except theoretically. It did have practical implications, as we will see when we get there, but this is kind of the background to that. It was very central to the events and developments of the 16th century that we'll be talking a lot more about. So, some of this is really problematic. So the emperor is part of that, it's usually called just the Germanic Empire. There's no such thing as Germany until 1871. And after Otto I in 962, it becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire, but it's still seen as the continuation of Rome. So, who could elect the emperor? Well, the most powerful princes. In 1354, Emperor Charles IV issued what's known as the Golden Bull, where he set the number of electors. Because had always been kind of controversy over who gets to elect the emperor, who doesn't. But in this bull of 1354, Charles IV, Emperor Charles IV, said, okay, there's going to be 7 electors. These 7 princes are going to be the electors who elect the emperor. There are 3 ecclesiastical princes, the Archbishop of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. Now, you say, wait a minute, the clergy is not supposed to be part of the nobility, but technically they very much were, because if you were, let's say, a second son of a prince, you don't want to keep splitting up. If you're the prince, you don't want to keep splitting up your territory. So you give the territory goes to your eldest son. Second son or third son then goes into the church. It's good to have family members in the church. And becoming part of the clergy was seen as a great career move and very lucrative too. If you could be appointed to a bishop or an archbishop, you could live very, very well. Now, yes, theoretically, you're supposed to be celibate. And since the reforms of Gregory VII in the 11th century, Gregory VII imposed celibacy all the way through the clerical hierarchy, in theory. In theory, in the Roman Catholic Church, priests are still celibate. In practice, no. Some are, I'm sure. I think there was a study done not very long ago when about 50% of the priests admitted that they didn't even try to keep their vow of celibacy. Same way in the Middle Ages. If you were a bishop or even the Pope, you could not get married because you were ordained. I'll get to that in a second too. Theoretically, you're supposed to be celibate, but priests had their housekeepers. Bishops and archbishops and popes had their concubines. Produced children, papal nephews, they were famously known, who were the offspring of popes, but they can't call them sons because they're technically celibate. So there is this intermixing of the clerical and the lay hierarchies through ordination, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy became also very powerful based on its land holdings. Because if you are a bishop, you are directly responsible for the diocese. If you're an archbishop, you're directly responsible for the archdiocese. If you're a priest, you're directly responsible for the parish. So there is this temporal part of being a clergy person, as well as the spiritual side of it. And that was also how we get those all things together. So when Charles IV names the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne as electors, He's not doing it because he's being pious. He's doing it because these archbishops of these territories, which goes back, they go back to Roman times, were very wealthy and very powerful. Then there were 4 lay electors: the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Duke of Saxony, the Count Palatine, and the King of Bohemia. So from this point on, there's only these 7. Now, I was in Mainz, in Germany, for about a year and a half. Love Mainz. And this was an old electoral city. And along the Rhine, because the Rhine goes right through Mainz, there was a 19th century monument to the electors. They portrayed the electors right along kind of the wall, the river going through. There are all 7, all dressed in full armor. You can tell who are the archbishops by other symbols that they have. But if you just look at it without knowing, you see, oh my God, these are just 7 knights, 7 huge knights. And that's what they were, archbishops too. In the later Middle Ages, they started being referred to as prince bishops. This is also going to be very important for our understanding of what was going on in the later Middle Ages when we get there. The concept of a prince bishop and the clergy were not simply spiritual people who wanted to devote themselves to God. They were powerful, wealthy people on the higher levels. Even if at the lower levels, on the parish level, still were not very wealthy or anything else. Anyway, so that's kind of putting that in context of the ecclesiastical lay hierarchies. It's all an issue of who ruled Europe. And I've mentioned this a couple times before in terms of ordination and excommunication. There was always something called the 2 swords. Goes back to scriptural references of the 2 swords. The 2 swords were seen as, the temporal leader, or the emperor, and the spiritual leader, or the pope. It's like, how are these related? What do we do with these 2 swords? And what is the spiritual sword? The temporal sword is easy. It's a sword that you can go out and kill people with. So that the emperor is supposed to defend the clergy. But what's the spiritual sword? Spiritual sword is excommunication. Means being cut off from the sacraments. Essentially, if you're cut off from the sacraments, you're going to go to hell. Basically. Big deal if you believe it. And that's the whole thing about the sacramental system, about Christendom as such, is based on belief. Henry IV, when he was excommunicated by Gregory VII in 1077, didn't care at first. He didn't believe Gregory had the authority to excommunicate him. He's the emperor. He thought Gregory himself was a heretic. But the problem is, if a king or a prince was excommunicated, that means everybody within their realm was excommunicated. That means no sacraments could be performed in those areas legitimately, which put a lot of pressure on Henry IV to make up with Gregory VII, the Pope. Now, the sacraments, as such, were defined at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 as numbering 7. Here on the slide, you have the 7 sacraments: baptism, confession, confirmation, Eucharist, ordination, marriage, and last rites or extreme unction. Before that, there are debates about how many are there, whether 8 or there 6 or there 5. The idea was that of these 7 sacraments, and if you look at it, they take you through birth, because baptism is shortly after birth, through death, so that the sacraments are with you at every stage. Confession and the Eucharist could be repeated. Supposedly none of the other ones could. If you were, either then had to be ordained to go into the priesthood or become married. Those 2 were seen as sacraments. Now, if you were a widowed or a widow, you could then become a religious. If you were a widow, you could become, so you technically you could have partake of all 7 sacraments. but not all at the same time, if that makes any sense, because you can't be ordained and be married at the same time unless you were a widower. So that is the sacraments issue, because the sacrament was defined as a visible means of an invisible grace. I'll be talking more about the economy of salvation later on, later lectures. But that is what really we're getting at here, that the sacraments were the means of salvation. If you believe in heaven and hell, and if you believe the sacraments were the means of you getting to heaven and avoiding hell, that's pretty important. Then after 1175, purgatory. The whole doctrine of purgatory begins to be developed after 1175. So there's threefold afterlife. Basic is heaven and hell. The damned are damned. But then the saved, well, there's some people are not so good that they can go right to heaven, or not so bad that they can go right to hell, so they go to this other place called purgatory. But if you went to purgatory, you're part of eventually those people would be saved. Just would take you a while to get there, where you basically suffered hell for a given period. It could be a long time, because we're talking about, eternity. This whole structure was based on belief. No, everyone within Christendom, at least by the year 1000, was Christian, except for the Jews. There were always kind of an exception. But what did it mean to be Christian? Early on, it meant you were baptized and you attended Christian worship. You went to Mass. That's about all it meant. Beginning in the 11th, 12th centuries, there began to be this new approach to saying almost, okay, now that everybody's Christian, how do we actually be Christian? A huge emphasis was given to pastoral theology, pastoral development. Let's teach Christians what they need to know and how they should live. Preaching really is flourishing at this time. We have all kinds of new developments at this time in the religious life of teaching people to be Christian. Now, that teaching aspect in Greek is called catechesis. There is no such thing as the catechism at this time. That is an early modern development, which I'll be talking about. But there were catechetical treatises. Every Christian was supposed to know the Lord's Prayer. Every Christian was supposed to know the Creed. Everyone was supposed to know the Ave Maria. And then how to celebrate Mass, how to go to confession, and to participate in worship and receive communion once a year. If you're a noble, you can receive it far more often, but this gets to be a whole other issue. So the sacraments were a big deal, and they were the means by which the clergy could control the laity. And I don't mean this in any devious sense. It was simply, this part of it was the responsibility of the clergy, because even the emperor could not go into a church and celebrate Mass and have the elements of the bread and wine be transformed into the body and blood of Christ. The emperor could not affect the sacraments. Only the clergy could. So on the clergy side, it was often argued that the lowest parish priest is higher than the emperor, because that parish priest can go and celebrate Mass, and when they elevate the elements of the words of institution, hocus corpus meum, this is my body, there's a transformation of the bread into the actual physical body of Christ, which too, transubstantiation, formulated at the Fourth Lateran Council as well, based on Aristotelian physics. For Aristotle, everything can be divided into substance and accidents. Substance does not change. Accidents do change. So, I'm wearing a white shirt right now. Last lecture, I had a light blue shirt on. Next lecture, they also have a white shirt or a light blue. I could have a black shirt on. I don't change. I'm going to be getting new glasses before too long. You'll see them, and I'll let you know. I mean, you won't have to. announce that they're new, but anyway, you'll see them when I get them. That is, if I, gained 50 pounds during the course of this semester, my accidents will have changed, but my substance would not have. Now, it was determined at the Fourth Lateran Council that in the Eucharist, in the Lord's Supper, what happens in this unique case is that the accidents remain the same and the substance is transformed, so that bread still looks like bread, still tastes like bread, the wine still looks like wine and tastes like wine, but the substance has been changed to be the actual physical body and blood of Christ. That's a big deal. It's all based on belief. But that power to make that transubstantiation, to effect it, to bring it about, to make God present right here and now physically, only the priesthood could do, only the ordained priesthood could do. And that was part of the sacrament of ordination. When you were ordained sacramentally, it changed the whole nature of your soul. That imprinted upon you what was called a character, that made it possible for you to affect the sacraments. Now, baptism could be done by lay people in cases of necessity. All the others had to be done by clergy. Absolution of sins. It all gets very messy, so to speak. But this is what kept Christendom together, was the sacramental system, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and its relationship and conflict with the lay hierarchy. And the lay hierarchy also kept Christendom together by defending Christendom, even if there's infighting constantly. I've often made the analogy with Christendom of being a family. I had a sister, still have a sister, supposedly. At times we got along really well, other times we didn't. I didn't have a brother. I knew kids growing up who had brothers and heard all kinds of stories about how they would fight fiercely. Witnessed it. And yet, if somebody picked a fight with somebody's brother, the brothers would all jump in to support that brother. Same with a family. They can be arguing and bickering within the family, but if something is threatening or attacking the family from outside, the family moves together. That's kind of what Christendom was like. There was all kinds of fighting, infighting, and jockeying for position and violence. But over against the outside world, it was a unified concept. We're Christendom. We're a family. We're a Christendom. Yeah, I hope that helps. Sacraments we'll be talking more about a fair amount when we get there. That's why they're so important here now. And the whole issue was salvation and damnation. How do we understand? Are we saved? How can we find our salvation and avoid hell? If you believe that, it's very powerful. Now, one way to help assure that you could get into heaven was to become a monk, which was technically called entering religion. I know I'm getting towards the end of this lecture, the time-wise, and this is very kind of complex, but I need to go through some of it in terms of monasticism. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. You can always ask me more about it later. I can come back to it as well. The idea of Christian asceticism or Christian discipline, because in Latin, being an ascetic was called being disciplined, disciplina. What do you need to do? How do you actually live a Christian life? There are two different forms, the vita activa, or the active life, and the contemplative life, the vita contemplativa. Mary and Martha, if you know the New Testament, the Christian New Testament, they became the standard example of the difference between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa. Being with the Lord in contemplation is one thing, but serving others in the active life is another. The priesthood was part of the active life, but being a monk, entering a monastery, entering religion became part of the contemplative life. Now, there was two ways of doing that: the cenobitic and the anchoritic, or a hermit or living in community. Anchoritic monasticism was being a hermit. Cenobitic was living in community. But then how do you live in community? Well, there had to be rules for doing so. In the West, we have the rule of St. Augustine, and we have the rule of St. Benedict. Long story behind both of these. Often the rule of St. Augustine is seen not to have been genuine, but it's been argued in a very impressive and detailed work by Luc Verheyen back in the late 60s, I think it is, 2 volumes in French, argues for the authenticity of the rule of St. Augustine, which is then earlier than the rule of St. Benedict. And there's been all kinds of issues in terms of Benedict. And one scholar, Francis Clark, has argued that St. Benedict never really existed. It was a creation, which makes a very persuasive argument. But the point here is that the rule of St. Benedict, whether or not it was actually by some person named Benedict or not, that's how it became known, became the standard rule in the West, even though Augustine's rule was earlier. Now, if you're a monk, you're under the authority of the bishops. If you were a monk, technically you were not part of the clergy. You're part of the laity. It was just a special way of living out your religious life. You entered into a state of being a religious. Now, the problem, though, if you're living in a community, or individual, but if you're living in a community of lay people, who performs the sacraments? So early on, there was dispensations made that would ordain some monks to become priests so they could serve as priests to their communities, all under the authority of the local bishop. So we have then monks who became ordained. This distinction between monks who were ordained and then the parish priest, who was not a monk, was the distinction between the regular and the secular clergy. The secular clergy were not people who didn't care about religion or theology. They did. They were just living the active life, not following a monastic rule or regula. So if you were a priest and following a monastic rule or regula, you were a regular priest. So there were monks who became regular priests. There were priests who were secular priests, meaning they were living in the world. That's what seculum meant at the time, living as part of the world, and ministering to the people. You know, early on, monasteries became centers of learning. They started copying the manuscripts in so many ways. It's the monasteries, both in England and on the continent, that preserved the classical learning traditions. Then with Charlemagne just kind of became a new starting point of developing further for their flourishing, we call the medieval Renaissance in the 12th century, the long 12th century. So they were very important places of learning and of education. They would also educate externs, as they were called. So if you're a prince and you want to have your heir learn to read and write Latin, you could send them to the monastery as an external student, not as to join up, but to be trained by the monks, and that could work. In the 10th century, though, there's a development of new forms of monasticism that developed. So we call it the new monasticism in a general sense, consisting of the following. Here, the new monasticism, Cluny, the regular canons, and then the mendicants. Now, Cluny was a cloister in France, in the city of Cluny. And in the early 10th century, members of Cluny felt that they were really trying to live a religious life, but most others around them weren't. So what they did was they petitioned the Pope to say, we want to be directly under your authority to live a reformed life, to really follow the rules, the rule of St. Benedict. The Pope said, great, okay, you are. Now, what did this do? This took Cluny outside of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, kind of analogous to the cities being taken out of the feudal hierarchy or the lay hierarchy. That development at Cluny just kind of continued, And in the 12th century, we had the development of regular canons, who then started following a rule because they thought, okay, with these new developments in monasticism, we too want to live a life. Now, what's a canon? A canon technically is a priest who serves at the cathedral. Cathedral is the seat of the bishop. So you cannot have a cathedral without a bishop. You can't have a bishop without a cathedral. There's a parish for it. But as I talked about, the bishops being like prince bishops from early on, they didn't want to preach all the time. They didn't want to sit and listen to people's confessions. So they started appointing priests to do the work, the pastoral work of the bishop on a regular basis. The bishop might preach on Christmas or Easter, might come in, whatever. Might hear the confessions of the prince, but not of the riffraff. So the priests attached to a cathedral rather than to a parish, aside from the parish cathedral, became known as canons of the cathedral. And they were the ones to elect the bishop, blah, 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 blah. But there became this movement in the 11th, 12th century among the canons to say we should too follow a monastic life. We should live a more thorough monastic life, religious life. In this upsurge, which in general, I'll be coming back to this term later, later lectures, I refer to as religionization. We go from confessionalization, we go from Christianization to religionization to confessionalization. Again, we'll go through that development later on. So if you're a priest serving a parish or serving people, doing the administrative work of pastoral care, you can't really follow the rule of St. Benedict, because the rule of St. Benedict was for monks who went out in the wilderness to live, or at least in the forest and away from the city and everything. But they could follow the rule of St. Augustine, because Augustine himself was a bishop. So they started to follow and adopt the rule of St. Augustine. Not all canons did, but some. They became known as the Augustinian regular canons. Canons who were following a rule. And what rule were they following? The rule of St. Augustine. And the Augustinian regular canons became very important for our story when we get there, because they were just one form of the new monasticism. And as followers of the rule of St. Augustine, they often began to see Augustine as the founder of their way of life, of their religious life, as regular canons. But then in the 13th century, another group emerged that also claimed Augustine as their founder, namely the Augustinian hermits, who were part of the mendicants, who were a new monastic movement in the 13th century, consisting of the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian hermits. These two were new forms. Technically, the mendicants were not monks. They lived in cloisters, but they were directed to the towns. They did not live in monasteries. They lived in cloisters within the towns, and their whole point was to preach and teach the people. The Franciscans were the first, the Dominicans more or less at the same time, and then a little bit later, about 40 years later, Pope Alexander IV said, you know what, this is really going well. We need to establish another one, and formed the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, or the Augustinian Hermits, and did so in 1256. So now we have a third Mendicant order. We'll be hearing a lot more about the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, OESA, Ordo Eremitarum Sancti Augustini, particularly the conflicts with the Franciscans and Dominicans. As we go through, and where this is all leading, is that Martin Luther was a member of the Augustinian hermits. We'll see that there when we get there. But these new movements directed towards the people, to teach the people what it meant to be Christian, how to live a Christian life, had a huge effect, and were very successful, as were the Augustinian hermits. So this is where the monastic view kind of fits in with what's going on and the developments within Christendom that really had begun around the year 1000. Everything from the new monastics, Cluny is a little bit earlier, but the new monasticism, the rise in population. There's economic developments and technological developments that I'm not going to go into here and now. But of all the different social structures and political and intellectual structures, we have then the rise of the universities in the 13th century, which I didn't even address too much, this corporate mentality, this ongoing tension between who rules Christendom as the sacraments are being defined more precisely, as who can get into heaven and hell is, and who's going to go to hell is being defined more precisely, and especially with the discovery, so to speak, of purgatory. We have this whole system being put together of, this religio-political entity called Christendom. The only big question is who ruled it and who had the final say. And the problem is, though, there had never been a single time when everything was working ideally, when everything worked theoretically, either from the imperial side or the papal ecclesiastical side. There's always tensions, always developments, always new developments. Very dynamic period, the Middle Ages. But this concept, this overarching myth, this overarching ideology started to really break asunder as we get into the 14th, onto the 15th and 16th centuries. And that is the story that we'll begin to see beginning next lecture with the crisis of the later Middle Ages. Now, as I said, there's no way I can squeeze 2 full semester courses into one lecture. I will be coming back to some of these points I've made here, but this provides, I hope, a foundation for understanding what we're going to be getting into starting next lecture to go from there. Even though I'll probably go back to fill in more detail about some things, refer back, but this is what I wanted to kind of get across to you in terms of what is going to change. Because in the course of the 14th through the 16th century, everything changes basically in many ways. Not everything, but there's significant change, which gets back to the issue of whether or not this change that takes place was revolutionary. Again, your final exam. So that's where we are. I hope this has helped. Please feel free to ask questions, as always. And I will be back and see you next time when we talk about the crisis of the later Middle Ages, which is really the beginning of what I've referred to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Thank you so much.